Okay, now we get to talk about one of our favorite topics with one of our favorite people, Doug. It's Jay Jaffe, who writes about the Hall of Fame all year round for Fangraphs, and who is also the author of the Cooperstown Case Book, one of the greatest books ever written about players and their Hall of Fame credentials. So if you don't know Jay's work, you're missing something special because nobody knows more about the Hall than he does. So, Jay, welcome to Starkville. How are you, my friend?
Hey, thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for that, all the kind words about my book. I mean, you already did enough by blurbing it back in the day, but it's always good to have the praises sung by someone like you.
Well, thank you. I think my favorite thing I ever did with your book is I saw you hawking it on the streets of Cooperstown one summer and talk somebody into buying it.
Yeah.
So, usually they get that kind of direct personal intervention. So you're welcome.
Right. Right.
All right. So Jay, there's
Right.
there's so much we want to talk to you about as we get closer and closer to the Hall of Fame election day. And I, I think we should start by asking you to put on your Steve Kornacki hat, not to be confused with your Brooklyn Dodgers cap, and tell us this. Do you think anybody will get elected? Because I think it's going to
Oh,
be close.
it's going to be a nail biter. I mean, like, for everybody who thinks that, um, the tendency of voters to reveal ballots before the election via Ryan Thibodeau's great tracker, which I know, we both probably are checking on a daily basis here.
Yeah.
People complain that it's drained some of the suspense. I don't think so. I mean, I think, when you only know what half the voters are doing, you still have a pretty wide range of outcomes. And it looks to me like we're going to have a nail biter. I mean, I think it's, I saw today Jayson Sardell, who does the probabilistic projections based on various factors, and he says he had Scott Rolen estimated at 26%. I don't love those odds.
Yeah.
That's up from what it was. That's up from what it was a couple of weeks ago. We've seen Todd Helton and Billy Wagner and Gary Sheffield all kind of rocket up the charts in terms of the percentages they're getting from the voters, the published voters, and the but those guys are flipping a lot of no votes to yeses, whereas Rolen is not. And so that's the subject of some consternation. The reason for that is because that Rolen already got some of that low hanging fruit in the last couple of years, and
Yeah.
in moving up to to the low 60s percentage wise. It's those voters are now coming around to Todd Helton. They're now coming around to Gary Sheffield, et cetera. So I don't know. I think I'd like to think, given that we've seen nail biters in the past, like Tim Raines and Edgar Martinez and Larry Walker get over the line, that we're going to see that with Rolen. But boy, I wish I felt more strongly that was going to happen, because it could be a very lonely summer up there for Fred McGriff if he's the only one elected.
Yeah, and us too. Jayson Sardell is the real Steve Kornacki of this process. I know he breaks
Yes.
down
Mm-hmm.
the voting trends like he does, and I was looking at that same projection that you were looking at, and he has Rolen at about 73-ish%, with obviously a lot of votes outstanding. So, I got to thinking about this. If nobody gets in, at least on our ballot, that would be twice in the last 3 years in which the baseball writers have elected no players. So that would be two shutouts in 3 years after there'd only been two in the previous 50 years. So, every election tells us something. What do you think that's telling us if it happens?
Well, I think it's the pendulum swinging. I mean, before the first the shutout 2 years ago, we had seen a rush of 22 players being elected in 7 years, which was the most that we'd ever seen in a surge of that size, or a span of that length. And I think, again, it was a matter of, we picked off some of those guys who might have stuck around a little bit longer on the ballots, like maybe Mike Messina, who I think entered the ballot the same year as Jeff Kent, 2014. Kent's now in his last year. there's a different world where maybe Messina takes until his last year to get in. So maybe some of those guys, their paths were accelerated a little bit. Obviously, I think we might be seeing a bit of a backlash to that as well. I think writers who were, especially older generations of writers who really, I think, were stingier with their Hall of Fame votes, have maybe decided, oh, that's too many people going in. We've got to crack down or whatever. Like, I don't see anybody. I mean, there aren't any slam dunks on here. Let's concede that. It's guys who take a little bit of investigation. I make their cases annually, but not everybody thinks as hard as I do about these things. And unless you're willing to do a little bit of a homework, you're not necessarily going to just check the box of Scott Rolen or Todd Helton without thinking about it. And a guy like Carlos Beltran, with the controversy attached to him, that might be one you're like, oh, I'm not going to think about it this year, maybe down the road.
Yeah. I'm sure you know that our man Glanville played with that Scott Rolen. I'm thinking he'd like to ask you about him.
Oh, yeah.
Why don't you do that?
Well, in a peripheral version of this question, I'm thinking about if you could give us like a visual graph of PEDs and the perception of that throughout the last maybe decade or so. And I asked that because I'm wondering, a guy like Rolen, Helton, whoever, people who are at least established as clean or proven to be or whatever, did that help them? Did you see some sort of bump? Has that flatline? I'm curious about the curve of that.
Yeah,
and how it
that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think voters have a certain fatigue, because of all of the time and all the hot air that was expended on Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and their candidacies. And yeah, I think some voters are looking to find the players that they may not have put up the big numbers that those guys did, but they do have clean reputations. I mean, Todd Helton has his controversies for sure. A couple of some alcohol related driving incidents and whatever, but that's of a different scale. And I think there is maybe some element to that in terms of voters find if they can't include Manny Ramirez and Alex Rodriguez on their ballot now, and they do have room, they maybe are willing to give a little bit more attention to some of these other guys, because they certainly have the space to. But others, I think are the PED, the talk about PED users has so turned them off of the process, that they're maybe more dismissive of having the privilege to vote. So I think it cuts both ways. I don't know that we get a single clear trend out of it. It's tough to, we can. I don't know. It's tough to discern one trend without quizzing every voter how they felt about it, because not everybody will answer that question.
Yeah. Okay. Now, since you just went there, why wouldn't Scott Rolen get elected? He was only 47 votes short last year, and the ballot's now wide open. No more Bonds or Clemens or Schilling or David Ortiz. And those guys got over 1,000 votes last year. That's a lot of room on these ballots that have opened up. I mean, you've dug in on Rolen as much as anybody. What do you think it is that some voters are still missing about Scott Rolen?
Well, I think there's still a certain segment of voters, just as a certain segment of baseball fans, is maybe downplays defense, the value of defensive metrics. I think it's always good to approach them with some caution. But in this case, we're talking about a guy who's, until Nolan Arenado caught up to him, he was third all time in fielding runs at third base and third all time in Gold Gloves. It's rare that it works out as perfectly as that. But he was never the league's best hitter. He is a top 10 to 15 hitter among third basemen all time. And there have been some great hitters there, but he's an even better fielder. And it's the combination of those two things that really puts him over the top. And I think particularly with third basemen, as I wrote, at length in my book, I think a lot of voters have had a hard time really accepting, the defensive value there. And how hard it is to find somebody who does both well. I mean, he's he's kind of a Ron Santo type, right down to the fact that his career ended in his mid-30s as opposed to being able to stick around to 40 years old or whatever.
Yeah, if he sticks around to 40, then he has an Adrian Beltran career, and it's easy.
Right.
But
he's only got. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, he's only got like I think 21 or 2,200 hits, which is kind of on the lower side. He doesn't have 400 home runs. He doesn't have all those statistical markers that I think people think great hitter, but he had high on base percentages and I think was maybe a little bit ahead of his time in terms of the appreciation of the total package that he brought.
Right. I had somebody in baseball say to me this winter, isn't Scott Rolen just a WAR guy, a wins above replacement guy? And I think that was his way of saying Scott Rolen didn't have that Hall of Fame aura, at least for him and for a lot of people. I do wonder if he'd have it now. I think StatCast would have changed the way we look at a guy like Scott Rolen. He was so Nolan Arenado-like in his time. I just wonder if the world would see that more clearly if we had all these incredible defensive metrics and data points to measure it, which we didn't have in his time. But I also understand the importance of aura, what aura means to a lot of voters. This is a year where we might only elect one player. If we're only going to elect one player, you have a segment of voters who want that player to feel like a Hall of Famer in their hearts and minds.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Do you have any issue with that, Jay?
Well, I think not everybody's Willie Mays, and I think that we've tried to spent the last 20 years trying to remind people that the Hall of Fame is full of all shapes and sizes. You don't always get the 95% first ballot guy, every year. I mean, those guys. Look, you don't need me to tell you that Frank Thomas is a Hall of Famer or so, or somebody like that. It's the ones who take a little bit of thought and require a little bit of analysis. And some people are like, some voters are like, if you have to think about it, he's not a Hall of Famer. I've heard that more than once. But when you go through and you look at the who's in the Hall of Fame, who's actually in there, you find that not everybody was that guy who was the MVP or at least a top 3 MVP choice perennially for a stretch of his career. So yeah, you don't always get that aura guy, and I think you don't always get that first ballot guy. And I think the notion that somebody has to be a first ballot type guy, or that we should be placing all this emphasis on what year a guy gets elected as a value determinant, I think is misplaced. It's cool when you get the Derek Jeters of the world or whatever. They're just easy choices. They have the milestones and get in on the first time. But again, Edgar Martinez's plaque hangs on the wall, just as Derek Jeter's does, and people come and they touch that plaque and they feel, they feel the reverence for both of those guys, and they have their memories of that of both of those players, and they're special too. And that's what it means to be a Hall of Famer. It's not just the guy who graduates first in his class, so to speak.
Let's loop Doug in on this. Doug, you played with Scott Rolen in his prime. How would you describe the aura that Scott Rolen projected?
Yeah, it's what's fitting for me with Rolen this year is with Fred Dog, but Fred McGriff and Crime Dog. You've rewarded the model of consistent excellence, right? Someone that there was years it was flashy, but even, by the league standard, and I guess PEDs or whatever, he was still the same guy, right? So there's something to be said for consistency. And, Scott, we called him Rock, Rock Rolen, because of his consistency. Of course, he was big, stature guy, but he was also very solid in every facet. And I always found with Scott that he was a guy that could have hit for average, but sort of wasn't quite the 40 home run guy. He was, it's almost like he could choose who to be, and wanted to always be himself, right? That, we always say, like, from Jasper, Indiana, Scott Rolen, he was always the same guy. And there's something to be said for that dependability, the sort of bringing the lunch pail, checking the timestamp, and going in every single day. And I remember conversations when Jimmy Rollins came up about, Rollins wanted to be the star. He had that. And Rolen just wanted to go to work and go home and destroy their opponent in between. And that was Scott, but yeah, some of the intangible moments I think of him is, I remember he talked to us at length about the mythology around the long-term deal the Phillies offered him and all these things, because he wanted to clear the air with his teammates that he wasn't rejecting us. He was making certain decisions that he wasn't confronted with contractually, but there was a sort of political effort. He was always very clear about of everything that was happening. So you kind of knew, and he was known for pulling people aside, a quiet leadership, and talk through a lot of things. But he had his rules, he had his kind of approach. So, but I think of a couple of moments. One was Wayne Gomes. He had 2 home runs against the Rays one game, and came in the locker room.
For those who don't remember Wayne Gomes.
What's that? Oh, Wayne Gomes was a pitcher. Yes. Oh yeah. And so Wayne was on our team, and Roland comes in after this great game, and almost in tears, Wayne was like, "It's such an honor and a pleasure to play with you. You're just one of the greatest players." And I think that's kind of what you felt with him, even if like all his numbers didn't tell the whole story. He was ferocious, running the bases and defense, and consistent. And he was funny. I remember when Guerrero was taking batting practice, Vladimir Guerrero Sr., and he said, "That guy is so much better than I am. It's ridiculous, but I'm still going to have my career." So yeah, I appreciated him. And so, yeah, this would be a great year for him, because he is kind of the Fred McGriff kind of storyline. He's very steady, and you don't look up and all of a sudden you're like, wow, great player.
Talk about I have a question.
No, go ahead, Jay.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask both of you a question. I mean, you guys probably, because you're both Philadelphia guys, in terms of Jayson, you covering it, and Doug, you playing there. I do wonder, Doug touched on it with the contract. I do wonder, a couple of things. First of all, if Scott Rolen had stuck around for that, that great run that the Phillies had a few years later, if he'd be in a better position from the voters, but also if the Phillies organization, I've got quotations from Larry Boa and Dallas Green, both publicly blasting him in there. And, obviously what was known about, the contract of the big extension offer that he got and turning it down, if the well was kind of poisoned for him there. And if that has, made the, I think, cost him in terms of perception. Now, the flip side of that is he got to go to St. Louis and, was on 2 World Series teams, including a champion. So he got his moment in the national spotlight, but I do wonder if there was, something that he missed out on because of the way that it all unfolded in Philadelphia, not entirely his own fault.
Yeah, what a great thought. Because I've never really thought about it in quite those terms, Jay. If he signs that deal, that extension offer, he is there as Rollins arrives and Utley arrives, and that team begins to form around him, and he sees where it's leading. His story would have been so different. As it was, Doug, I know you know this, but Scott was a fairly opinionated human being. He had thoughts, and he would let you know what those thoughts were. And that's why he got into it with Larry Boa and Dallas Green, because when he did not agree with something, they know it. It wasn't like he would just put his head down and not say anything. He felt like he was a guy on those teams, and he needed to be the one who said that. And so that had a lot to do with all of that.
I mean, it's not what he didn't see it as a fit for him. and that's it.
Right.
Once he's locked in on that, that's it. You know, I mean, he played well with Francona. I think that maybe if Francona was still there, but I don't think he really felt that that was the best match for him. And when you get to free agency and you have finally the power to choose, or you make a choice. You know, I left Philadelphia, and I love Philly on a lot of levels, but I left for opportunity. You finally earned that right. Now, a couple of stories that come to mind.
They did trade him, Doug. I mean,
Yes.
that's how
No,
it ended,
exactly.
as you
But
know.
that was, I think it had a lot to do with they weren't going to sign him. All right.
Right, of course.
And so that was clear. Okay. As you mentioned, clear. But I think, okay, Jimmy Rollins, I mean, and Scott was funny, but Jimmy came up talking nonstop, which we love him for. And Scott Rolen called a meeting with me and Bobby Abreu and said, Jimmy Rollins is getting kicked out of this batting practice group like tomorrow. That's it. I can't take it anymore. And so he kicked him out of the group, and he told them, and it was like he was kind of asking us, but not really. And poor Jimmy was silent for like 3 days. And Scott was like, that's it, you know, and so he had, and look, we were in Cleveland, you know, in the final year, we were in Cleveland. And all these quotes, supposedly anonymous, supposedly leaked out. And it's talking about how Rolen is a cancer. He's terrible for the locker room and all this. And Rolen like called a meeting. Cleveland said, whoever said this about me needs to stand up like right now. Like, of course, nobody said anything, but he was like, you know, he wanted to go to the source. He wanted to go to the press and find out who your sources were. He was just like, no, you don't get to talk behind my back like this. I mean, that's how it went that season. And so, you know, Scott was very consistent. So the way he turned this into something funny was we have a quilt that's made every year for charity. I think it's by the players' wives and girlfriends or something. And every player got a square in this quilt. So, you know, Scott, you know, I guess had submitted his square, and he's traded to St. Louis. So I'm really last to do this because I'm not married at the time. I may not have a girlfriend, whatever. So I was like, and you're supposed to go in and sign your square, and they auction it for charity. So I finally go in. I'm one of the last players to sign this quilt. And in the middle of the quilt is a black square. Like, it's all red and white, Phillies color, and there's a black square in the middle of it. So I'm like, I look a little closer, and Roland had sketched like a painting, basically, of himself in uniform standing over a dock as if he's going to jump into the ocean. And it's like choppy waters. There's ravens in the sky. It's purple, dark green. It's like a tornadoes in there. And that was his final message. Like, this is a charity for like Philly's Wife charity. Let's auction this off. And he literally puts like death and despair with like a tombstone in the middle of this quilt. So I was once I figured it out, I could not stop laughing to the point it was like 15 straight minutes. I could not stop laughing. So I pick up the phone and I call Scott, and he's already traded by then. And as soon as he answers it, he's laughing hysterically. He never said hello. He just started laughing. He's like, I know what happened. I mean, so that was Scott. Like, it was his game. Like, he played the game, and for that, he was just like a legend in Philly. So he had the straight face. He had his rules. He was very opinionated. But in the end, he's like, I just want people to do it the right way. And if you don't, I'm going to use some humor against you. So anyway, I always appreciated Scott. And I'm sure we could talk about Bobby Abreu, by the way, as well. So two players that I played with that kind of have this like on the cusp thing about them.
Yeah. Well, look, we got to move on, but just bottom line here, you know, I had somebody at the Hall of Fame say to me, this was at a point where it looked like it's still possible that the Veterans Committee could elect Curt Schilling and that the writers could elect Scott Rolen. He said, wow, it'd be a big summer for us with Philadelphia, huh? And I said, I don't know about Philadelphia and Scott Rolen. I don't think Philadelphia is that excited about Scott Rolen getting elected. But anyway, let's move on, because to be honest, the guy I really want to ask you about is Carlos Beltran. You know, Jay, Doug and I were just talking about the John Capalilla story that I wrote, and about how Alex Cora and AJ Hinch, after their suspensions, got managerial jobs. And it makes me wonder, like, Carlos Beltran already paid a price for the Astros scandal. Is it now his turn to wear that scandal? Is he going to pay the price by not getting elected to the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, look, I do wonder that, and I was very concerned about that going into this cycle when we didn't really have, you know, much of a gauge of what to expect. I think I wrote, like, I was in my profile, which was probably the longest profile I've written of any player the side of A-Rod. Um, you know, I worried that he might get under 5%. Because everybody turned away from him all of a sudden. That's not the case. I haven't seen the latest in the tracker, but I know he was coming in there 50-ish%
He's over 50%.
or whatever. So I'm not.
Yep.
Yeah. So he's going to be fine. I mean, I think. Well, I'm not going to say he's going to be fine. Because there are caveats here. We'll get back to that.
How are we defining fine?
I do. Yeah, I do think. I do think that it is very conspicuous to me the way that he was kind of left holding the bag, as though he were like, look, we know Carlos Beltran is a very charismatic and very smart player with Hall of Fame level statistics. I mean, 2,700 plus hits, 435 home runs, Gold Gloves, defensive metrics, and highest stolen base percentage. I mean, he's a top 10 guy in Jaws. It was very conspicuous, though, that he was the only player named in Rob Manfred's report. Personally, he doesn't seem to have benefited statistically. He had the worst season of his career. He was basically on his last legs, retirement-wise. But it seems like he was left to wear, a lot of the responsibility and a lot of the blame. And while Alex Cora and AJ Hinch, got jobs as soon as they were eligible after being suspended, Beltran lost his managerial job. His name, I don't think, has been considered seriously for any managerial opening since. And it seems to me like I have a problem with that, and I especially I do think what he did was very serious. It disappoints me. I thought about not voting for him myself, but I also think that, as Manfred made clear in his famous September 2017 memo and in his report, the onus on enforcing these rules was on the teams, and that was why Luno and Hinch were the ones suspended, and Cora was the one suspended rather than the players. And it seems kind of backhanded that Beltran has been punished, in the court of public opinion, and I don't like that. That bothers me because, yeah, I do think, his punishment has lingered much longer. So that's kind of where I am at it, and I tossed and turned about whether he'd be on my ballot.
Yeah, I haven't revealed how I voted yet, so I'll have to leave everybody in suspense on that until I write my ballot column next week. But I can tell you, I agonized over that vote for a long time. He stopped me from sending off my ballot for days, and I think the reason is that Carlos Beltran makes us think deeply about the whole concept of cheating in baseball. And so I feel like if you're one of those voters who has never voted for any of the PED guys because they're cheaters, I don't see how you can possibly vote for him. But if you're somebody like me who did vote for Bonds and Clemens, then a guy like Carlos Beltran lives in that gray area where, we're trying to weigh his career before he got to the 2017 Astros. What if he'd never played for that team? He would never been named in the report. None of that would have happened. And just trying to judge whether his kind of cheating was the same as the cheating that everybody's punishing the PED dudes for. And I'm curious, Jay, where do you stand on that whole aspect of it?
Yeah, I think the PED guys, as in my research, if you think that the use of performance enhancing drugs in baseball began when Mark McGwire and Jose Canseco started shooting up in the A's clubhouse, boy, have I got some oceanfront property in Kansas to sell you, because it goes back to the 19th century. Pud Galvin, using some snake oil and Babe Ruth reputedly injecting extract from sheep testicles, and all manner of players all manner of players in the 1960s, experimenting with amphetamines, and to the point that we had decades where amphetamine use was rampant, and amphetamines are a higher class of regulated drug by the food, the FDA. So, there's a continuum there, and just as there's a continuum with PED usage, and users are in the Hall of Fame, users who padded their numbers, because they were staying in the lineup when they should have been sleeping one off or whatever, in the 70s or 80s or whatever. There's the sign stealers. I mean, we had all kinds of sign stealers. I remember when I was researching the Beltran article, I came across, it was only a few years ago that the 1951 Giants came clean about the fact that they had an electronic system, to steal signs. And I mean, the most famous, one of the most famous moments in baseball history is now indelibly attached to to a sign stealing system. And I think it was the New York Post. Somebody, these guys are practically gloating. It's like, yeah, you guys used illegal sign stealing to flip the 1951 pennant race. It's like, yeah, we did. And apart from sparing a thought for Ralph Franca and the grace with which he wore, his role as the GOAT, they were pretty unrepentant. We've kind of glamorized sign stealing over the years. We meaning just the general baseball public and the media. And I think it's to me, it's just it's not that far from the way that ball doctoring, spitballing has been glamorized. Gaylord Perry didn't get into the Hall of Fame immediately because there was something of a logjam, but he's in the Hall of Fame because he won 300 games and struck out 3,000 guys and was an incredibly colorful character who's unfortunately no longer with us. But I had a lot of fun writing about his career. But there's sort of a nod and a wink that comes with a lot of this stuff, and I feel like if it hadn't affected a championship, we probably would feel that way or closer that way about Carlos Beltran.
Doug,
he didn't break any. He didn't break any records, and the way that so there's less. There would have been less outrage, real or performative, over what he did.
Yeah, Doug, I would love to hear you weigh in on that, because you and I've talked about cheating quite a bit over the years.
Yeah, like it's challenging. I mean, I think what's the major way we evaluate these players in getting into the Hall of Fame? It's numbers. It's just numbers, right? It's timing and numbers, and it's all floating around that. And it does appear to me that PEDs was more consequential to those numbers than sign stealing. I think that's, and I mean, I've written about this from a player standpoint. You think about, just take my career. Who was I competing against? Yeah, many times it was the guy in the other dugout, but many times it was this hidden world of who's beating you out for the center field job in Philadelphia. Who are you competing against when you go to arbitration, or when the jobs open up in the off season and you're all fighting for a fourth outfielder? Who are you competing against? When the entire league is elevated, or there's a whole class of players elevating these numbers artificially or enhanced wise, that creates a career problem for you. And I think that also has the same implications of those who are being weighed against you in the court of opinion around who is a Hall of Famer, who's not. I mean, there's a connection there. And so that's, yes, if you're the Houston Astros 2017 or whatever year, and you're stealing signs, I mean, yes, of course you're beneficiaries and it's horrible. But I know, like, if the whole league, and I'm sure there was other teams, okay, but the whole league is, everybody's doing this. First of all, pitchers won't stand for it eventually, because it's like, how would you ever think that system would sustain when pitchers are just getting beat to death out there, and just saying, oh, it's cool, for when you're destroying an entire position. Your entire profession as a pitcher is destroyed, and you're just going to let the hitters win because it's your team. Like, that was unsustainable. So we could blame Mike Fiers or whoever, but no, after a while, the pitching world would have revolted against that. But that being said, I think that's that's how I differentiate. So yeah, Beltran, I mean, yeah, I'm sure, first of all, stealing signs, under certain circumstances, it's pretty normal. Like, and I didn't even like it when we were in Texas and like, okay, get on second base and communicate. I found that to be very uncomfortable to me. So I don't think we even did it as a team when we could have. So anyway, I do think that that's where I kind of ask those questions. Like, all right, which thing has much more of a direct linear correlation to you being a viable candidate in the Hall of Fame, and are they equal? And I guess that's the question.
Yeah.
What's the answer? Go ahead, Jay. You're the arbiter of all things.
Oh, I don't know. Well, I mean, where I ended up coming down was when I voted, when I voted for Hall of Fame ballots, and before that, when I was doing my virtual ballots, it's just a way to show, where your lines in the sand end up leading you, and just how difficult it is to fill out a Hall of Fame ballot. When it came to the PED users, I kind of drew the line at 2004, the advent of testing and suspensions, and said everything before that belongs to the Wild West period, where maybe these guys had a pretty good idea of just what advantage they were getting, but Major League Baseball was uninterested and unwilling to punish them, and it was kind of a complete institutional failure. You had owners looking the other way. You had the commissioner, loath to enforce anything. I leave that in one box, and then anybody who tested positive afterwards knew what the consequences were, and I judge accordingly. So I have voted for Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens. I voted for Sammy Sosa once, because all we have on him is the survey test. I mean, eye test, sure, but the survey test was which predated the actual testing and penalties. Whereas I have not voted for Alex Rodriguez or Manny Ramirez. I'm a yes on Gary Sheffield. I'm a no. And that leads you to a strange place where your ballot is a patchwork. If you were to rank the players 1 to 10 in terms of who had the best numbers, and you're voting for players 3, 4, 1, 3, 5, 6, and 9. But 2, 4, 7, and 8 have been ruled out because of that's weird. Let's just acknowledge that's weird. But where I ended up, and I think what kind of swung it for me when I filled out my ballot, and I spent a lot of time at the winter meetings in San Diego talking to voters and other writers, how they viewed it. But where I landed was like, look, if Major League Baseball couldn't apply a punishment to Beltran, just as they couldn't do it to Bonds or Clemens, other than the publicity and innuendo, then I don't want to be I don't want to be the one applying frontier justice here. I think that the league wants us to be the henchmen. No, I reject that. If he's on the ballot, he deserves my consideration, and I have my line. And ultimately that was why I voted for Beltran.
It's been interesting to watch the Beltran vote on the Hall of Fame tracker that you mentioned earlier. Early on, when I was still messing with my ballot, I was looking at this really closely. It felt like most of the voters who were voting for Beltran were also writers who were voting for A-Rod and Manny, and that makes total sense. But we've seen that start to change. I'll give you an example. Here at The Athletic, just this week, we had 14 of our voters reveal their ballots. You can find it on our site right now. 12 of the 14 voted for Beltran, but 8 of those didn't vote for either A-Rod or Manny. And then there was Keith Law, who voted for A-Rod, but not Manny. So it just tells you how complicated this is. I'd like to ask both of you guys, what does that tell us? What do you, I understand everybody who doesn't vote for A-Rod and doesn't vote for Manny and doesn't vote for Beltran, but mixing those names on the ballot, not voting for A-Rod, not voting for Manny, but voting for Beltran, what is that saying? Doug, what do you think it's saying?
Well, I mean, I think Jay, mentioned how it's you try to come up with a methodology, and it's could be imperfect. You try to make it defensible. But when it comes to crime, I mean, there's all kinds of people who've gotten away with crimes, or like the institutions look the other way. And And, just like, and that's doesn't necessarily mean that it's unimpeachable but I think I think when you deal with Beltran, I guess for me, I would probably separate him from A-Rod and Manny Ramirez. I mean, that's probably how I did that. I'm not a voter, but I'd make probably some distinction between the two. I think there's an element of if once you get a younger generation of voters and people kind of say, well, it's a good era anyway, I don't really care. I mean, you might get that, and A-Rod may at some point get in, despite that. So I do think that there's a generational component, an age component, and I think if it underscores the real poison to what PEDs and many of these scandals do to the game, and that is you can't really resolve it that well because it's so unclear, and that's what it did to the game, right? I mean, and sure, there's many examples, so I'm not saying it's just PED guys, but that's what happens. You really it taints the color, it colors your whole history and all the numbers that are associated with it, which is tragic, I think, in a lot of ways.
And so
And that was the selfish decision of many, and also institutional failures. So I don't think it's one thing.
And so do you think that the PED era left its mark on those of us who vote, and now we don't know what to make of any kind of cheating?
I mean, that's what it feels like. It does. And I believe, yeah. RJ.
I remember writing this for the Baseball Prospectus book, Extra Innings, in I believe it came out in 2011. And Jayson, this was one of the first times I'd written about the Hall of Fame voting in PEDs at length. And I think it was you I actually quoted in there about Mark McGwire hitting the ballot. And it was and I did the math, and I was like, we are going to be talking about PEDs in the Hall of Fame for the next 30 years. That was my math, and that was based on Alex Rodriguez
right
having a 15 candidacy. The Hall of Fame trimmed that to 10 years, but that's still, A-Rod is going to be eligible now until 2031, and Mark McGwire hit the ballot in 2007. That's a quarter of a century of just annual PED discussion, and like we're trapped by it.
Make it stop.
It's the anti gift that keeps on giving. Like, in some ways, if guys like Bonds and Clemens had been elected, maybe we wouldn't be talking about this. Maybe all this stuff would die. Like, we wouldn't be confronted with it as an annual debate, and we could maybe get some closure on the era and say, yeah, boy, a lot of people really messed up, including these guys, but they were still Hall of Famers. Move on, and let's in the future be more vigilant about cheating and try to keep harder lines. But no, the fact that this stuff lingers, I think, makes and the fact that we do chase our tails in trying to rationalize some route through these various conundra, maybe isn't good for us in that way, and then it keeps us sort of like with a moving the goalposts to what our gut tells us rather than any kind of moral certitude. I don't know. It just occurred to me that with all that listening to what Doug said and having sympathy for his plight. And I did think for a second there about a couple of players that, when I vote, I'm more of a bigger Hall guy, although not too big a Hall guy because I'm only voting for 7 this time. But, some of the guys I'm voting for, yeah, if they were clean, they were competing against these PED guys. If their numbers are just a little bit short, like I think Bobby Abreu is an example. I don't have any evidence that Bobby Abreu used. I'm going to assume that he didn't, while leaving open the possibility that, hey, we don't know everything. But if Bobby Abreu is kind of in that fringe for me, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because I don't think he did anything, and maybe he would have been a bigger star if he tried to keep up in that arms race, so to speak, or if there hadn't been other guys, doing stuff that we now know.
We could talk about this for like 6 hours without any trouble, but I'm going to spare people that. I do want to ask you one more thing, though.
Sure.
You've been writing this brilliant stuff about the Hall of Fame for many years, but you've only been voting for the Hall of Fame for, what is it, 2 years, 3 years?
3.
So what has it been like to actually fill out that ballot? Is it a thrill? Has it changed the way that you go about your process in any way?
It's yeah, it on one level it's anticlimactic because when I got the ballot the first time, it was the first shutout since 2013. And the fact that there's now potentially a second shutout in my 3 years of voting, that irony has not been lost on me. I spent so much time helping voters come to the decision to elect a lot of these guys that they're not left on the ballot for me. So that's kind of funny in a way. At the same time, like, look, it is so damn cool. I didn't go into this thinking that I would ever get the vote. It is, and I'm sure you're aware of this, Jayson. You get that first email, it's in the middle of the playoffs. October 25th or 27th, the Hall of Fame sends you an email saying, hey, you are qualified to vote in the Hall of Fame election. Please check your address. If that thing comes in the top of the fifth inning, I have filled it out before the bottom of the fifth inning has started. I'm like, yep, we're doing this. We're doing this. Not gonna wait. And every communication that comes thereafter, I'm just like making sure I'm on top of this. I'm not going to screw this up. And then I get that ballot, and I have a special spot in my office, which unfortunately does not get regular cleaning. But I put it there, and I make sure it's there, and I check it, even though there's no way my daughter could reach it or anything like that. There's, nobody else is nosy enough to start rifling through it, and I check it. But then I go through my process, and I look at every candidate. Again, Fangraphs is very generous with the amount of space that they afford me, and they let me, take a 4,000 word profile and apply, just check some facts in it, update the voting stuff, and publish it again so voters can see it again instead of having to dig through last year and do their own mental math. And so I take seriously the reevaluation every year of these guys. And then, sometime between Christmas and New Year's, I sit down and like, okay, these are my yeses from last year. I don't think I'm changing on those. Now, what are we going to do about Beltran? What are we going to do about K-Rod? That was the other one this year that I had some question which way I was going to go. And you feel the weight of it. I feel the weight of it because I'm on social media. I've got a substantial following. I see the way that fans attack people who don't vote that they want to vote. It's like watching piranhas strip a cow. I mean, it can be brutal. I'm wary of that, but I want people to know that, regardless of the final vote, I've thought about this. I've done the best I can, and so I do take it seriously. But it is an honor and it's a thrill to do it, and I don't ever want it to feel like it's something that I take for granted, because it means a lot. I'm not somebody who came up through the newspaper ranks and had was slogging it out on the road at the ballpark and trying to beat deadlines every single night. But for the most part, the BBWA peers in the BBWA have accepted me, as one of their own, and told me directly or indirectly that they value my work. So it means a lot to me for that kind of acceptance, so I do take this very seriously when I do it, and I do, I think it just means a lot that people like yourselves, people who've been doing this a lot longer than I have, value what I do and use it as an aid in their own ballots. So it's, and look, it's good to have something that your employer knows that you're going to be one of the most read writers in the country for a couple months. Let's not kid it. We all need a hook, Jayson. You've got your weird and wacky and whatever, and among other things and all that. I mean, having this little niche of my own has been, has been big for me, and I try to maintain it with as best I can.
Well, we're all grateful that you have that niche. We definitely value your work here in Starkville, and really glad that you stopped by to visit us and to enlighten us. I know you got me charged up about this Hall of Fame election. So happy Hall of Fame season, man. I can't wait to read every word that you write about this in the next couple of weeks.